In what may go down as one of the most consequential trade policy decisions in recent history, former U.S. President Donald Trump triggered a global economic tremor by imposing a sweeping 50% tariff on all imported copper under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, arguing that copper is now a strategic resource vital to national security. The policy, officially implemented on August 1, 2025, set off an immediate chain reaction that disrupted markets, upended supply chains, and sparked a retaliatory trade shift from one of America's most critical partners, Canada. Within just one day, copper prices on the U.S. COMEX exchange surged by 13%, reaching a historic $5.95 per pound, while domestic futures prices followed suit, climbing further to $5.69 per pound. This spike led to an instant $4.2 billion hit to the U.S. economy, not in abstract projections but in real, measurable losses to companies, consumers, and industries dependent on this indispensable metal. Copper, often called the metal of electrification, is essential to nearly every facet of modern infrastructure, from electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels, to home wiring, electronics, and power grid systems. As such, the tariff quickly became more than a policy shift. It became the epicenter of a national supply chain crisis. Canada, which accounted for over 40% of U.S. copper imports and more than 52% of its own copper exports to the U.S. in 2023, did not hesitate. The Canadian government, alongside major mining companies like Teck Resources, Hudbay Minerals, and Glencore's Canadian subsidiaries, halted all copper exports to the United States and rapidly rerouted shipments to markets in Asia, including Japan, China, and South Korea. Ottawa simultaneously announced a massive $1.8 billion investment in infrastructure to support this pivot, including port expansion and refining capacity, marking a historic realignment of Canada's trade priorities and positioning the country not just as a copper exporter, but as a full-scale player in the global metal supply chain. Meanwhile, in the United States, the impact was immediate and deeply destabilizing. Domestic copper production can only meet about 53% of current demand, and refining capacity has been shrinking for years, with major facilities such as ASARCO in Arizona facing closures and maintenance backlogs. The result? A tightening copper market with no fast way to fill the gap left by Canada's exit. American electric vehicle manufacturers like Tesla and General Motors reported mounting monthly losses, with the cost of copper-related components adding upwards of $3,000 to $6,000 to the price of each EV. Small and mid-sized manufacturers of transformers, circuit boards, and copper wiring in states like Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana are struggling to stay competitive, especially against Asian manufacturers whose material prices remain stable. The energy sector, heavily dependent on copper for grid expansion and maintenance, is now seeking emergency rate increases, with utilities reporting copper wiring cost increases of up to 25%. As the U.S. copper price diverges sharply from the global benchmark set by the London Metal Exchange, where prices have remained lower due to falling American demand, an arbitrage imbalance has emerged, further distorting trade flows and exposing systemic weaknesses in the U.S. strategy. The fallout has reached every corner of the economy. Construction firms are experiencing cost spikes of $17,000 to $22,000 per home, primarily due to rising prices in copper piping and wiring, while consumer electronics companies are warning of upcoming price hikes on laptops, appliances, and smart devices. As U.S. copper stockpiles dwindle, companies are bracing for even more severe disruptions once inventories run out. Financial institutions including UBS and Goldman Sachs have issued warnings that U.S. GDP could decline by as much as 0.5 percentage points this quarter, with some suggesting that this single tariff has accelerated the economy's trajectory towards stagflation, a toxic mix of high inflation and low growth. The copper tariff, intended as a protective economic measure, has instead exposed America's dependence on foreign refined metals, its lack of strategic reserves, and its eroding influence in global supply chains. Canada, once seen as a cooperative North American supplier, has now asserted itself as a strategic economic rival, rapidly cultivating new partnerships in Asia and positioning itself as a central copper node between Latin American mines and global markets. This shift is not symbolic, it is structural, long-term, and supported by real capital investment. As Canada builds out export terminals and expands refining partnerships abroad, the United States is left facing the consequences of isolationist policy in a globalized era. Industry groups across sectors are pleading for exemptions or revisions to the tariff, while state governments are pressuring Washington to restore stable copper flows or risk losing high-tech jobs and clean energy investments. What was once a policy debate over national security has become a real-time economic upheaval, affecting everything from the price of electricity and vehicles to the future of domestic manufacturing. And while some in Washington argue that the long-term benefit will be increased domestic production, experts warn that such capacity cannot be built quickly or cheaply, especially when the very raw materials needed to build refineries, grids, and electronics are now prohibitively expensive. Ultimately, the 50% copper tariff may not protect American industry, it may accelerate its decline. And as the world watches this unprecedented shift in the metals trade, it's becoming increasingly clear that the first decisive move in this new trade war did not come from Washington, it came from Ottawa. In the battle over copper, Canada has flipped the script, and the United States now finds itself on the defensive in a global economy it once helped shape.